Hello, this is Kurt Messick, and we are up to the week on political philosophy in our Intro to Philosophy class. You'll be studying the political philosophy of a lot of different philosophers in the Popkin and Stroll book, including Plato, Hobbes, Locke, Rawls, J.S. Mill, Karl Marx, and perhaps a few others along the way as well. But those are the key figures for you to look at. Plato is first in terms of chronology as well as in significant political philosophical development. His idea of the perfect republic, sort of the idea of coming up with perfect ways of doing things, would come at different periods in time, Plato being the first, really saw philosophers as being in charge. No mistake, he was a philosopher, so of course he would want philosophers to be in charge. There's a series of television commercials on right now where you have sort of, what if firemen ruled the world, what if roadies ruled the world, what if baggage handlers ruled the world, and it shows you how society might be structured in certain ways if different professions ruled. Well, Plato actually took himself seriously in this regard and thought that philosophers should rule, and came up with a very interesting, if not entirely workable, system of philosopher kings and a warrior middle class and an underclass of artisans and craftsmen, in which everyone would know his or her place, and people would essentially be born into place or trained for the position they were born into. Not very democratic at all in many ways, and really goes against some of our basic understandings of how society should be structured. But it does have some interesting points and is well worth exploring in many ways. It was one of the first philosophy books that I was able to read in its original language once upon a time, and while my Greek has gotten rusty, I still have an affinity for Plato's Republic for that reason. You'll also learn about Hobbes and Locke, who were not too far apart from each other in the Enlightenment period. Thomas Hobbes wrote about social structure which needed authority, sort of a strong arm to hold the people down so that they don't break out into mass anarchy, and thought that even if you have dictatorship that was not all that good, that was still better than the anarchic state in which we would find ourselves. That was often used as a justification for people to become tyrants and dictators, and especially absolute monarchs loved the idea. John Locke occurred at a time in which Parliament in Britain was beginning to assert the rights of the people over the monarch. That shouldn't be confused with democracy or mass democracy as we know it today, because the voting class in Britain at that time in the 1600s was still very, very small. It was white, property-owning males of a certain social class and a certain education, but it still represented a significant leap over the idea that one person would rule over all autocratically with no real checks and balances. In fact, the idea of checks and balances can often be traced back to the ideas that Locke had, and those would get incorporated into the American Constitution. Some of Locke's ideas will also get incorporated into Jefferson's document, the Declaration of Independence. In fact, some portions are so close that Jefferson might have been accused of plagiarism of ideas, if we didn't have a tradition at that time of borrowing, and borrowing freely. John Stuart Mill comes along a little bit after the American Revolution, and he's had time to reflect historically on the ideas of Hobbes and Locke and the continuing development of the Constitution in Britain and the implementation of the written Constitution in America, and see how those things are working. And at that time, they seem to be working very well. He wrote a book called On Liberty, which I consider to be a really good thing to read. In fact, it usually makes my top 100 list of books that every college graduate should read. So if you're interested, you might pick up a copy of that. Karl Marx came along in the middle of the 1800s. He often gets a bum rap, primarily because we associate him with communism, which is true. But communism, as it lived itself out in the 20th century with Stalin and Chairman Mao and experiments in North Korea and other such places with communist rule, really would not have appealed to Karl Marx. even though he did distrust the idea of private property, and he did distrust the idea of major industrialists who would rule over all, he had something of a point that some people would tap into with the trade unions movement, and also with later ideas of employee ownership of companies. So you get programs where employees buy shares, sometimes employees buy their companies outright. And those things could also tap into Marxist ideas. John Rawls is perhaps the most recent of people in our reading list in Popkin and Stroll this week. And one of the things about John Rawls is that he looks for a system of justice that is related to economic fairness as well as political fairness. Do we really have equality under the law in the political sense if we are so unequal in an economic sense? So I invite you to read through his stuff and see what you think. There are other books that I can recommend in addition to the On Liberty book from J.S. Mill. One you might pick up sometime if you're interested in continuing with philosophy would be a book like this. This is the Blackwell Companion to Philosophy. There are different companions to philosophy, the Oxford Companion, the Cambridge Companion. I have those too, and I may share some things out of those later in the semester. But here we have different topical arrangements, such as Political and Social Philosophy, written by David Archad. And he writes on Rawls and another person named Robert Nozick on justice. And he says that there are various writings of John Rawls that are now taken to signify the beginning of a distinctly new era. The publication of Rawls' A Theory of Justice has proved a landmark, radically changing the character of the English-speaking world's political philosophy and supplying the eliminable background against which all subsequent discussion has been conducted. That might be overstating it just a little bit, but in fact it does show how important Rawls can become. The theory of justice really looks to a preservation of certain aspects of our democratic institutions as well as minority rights in addition to majority rule, something that is a constant tension, but it also looks for economic justice and fairness as well. It says here, Rawls has provided political philosophy with an agenda. He does not just offer a theory of justice, he supplies an account of the priority of individual liberty, the defensible limits of egalitarianism, and the rule of law. So there are things to look at with regard to Rawls. A companion book such as this will often also highlight key philosophers, John Locke being one of them. R.S. Woolhouse writes about him. John Locke is one of the most important European philosophers of the early modern or immediate post-Cartesian period, Cartesian being Descartes. And he, in many ways, is primarily known for an epistemological masterpiece, we'll talk about that in a few weeks, called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, but also for his two treatises on government, and that's what we'll be concentrating on this week. This is a very important landmark in terms of codifying political philosophy as something that we can really put into practice. The book also talks about Karl Marx, and one of the problems with Karl Marx, it freely identifies, it says, that from Engels onward, Marxists have taken the refuge in such phrases as that the economic structure is determinant ultimately, or in the last instance, and it is notoriously difficult to pin down just what such claims mean, or how they could be assessed. One of the problems, of course, with a lot of philosophy is people use wiggle words. They might say sometimes, or usually, or always, and sometimes even when they're speaking precisely, they have redefined things in such a way that it becomes very limited in case, or they may be using an entirely new language. Most philosophers today, if they want to make a name for themselves, have to create a whole new language while still using the one that everyone can tap